So let's talk about doom metal amplifiers and the concept of volume, power, and headroom. I get a lot of questions about what makes a good amplifier for this genre of music, whether it be, should I get a master volume amp or a non-master volume amp? Should I get a 50 watt or a 100 watt? 100 watts the answer, obviously, etc. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about some of these things and hopefully give you all some insight on the topic. If you're new to the channel, my name's Jason Johnson and I run Fuzzlord Effects. And on this channel, we do gear demos, as well as tech talks like this video. And we do some time-lapse footage of the work being done at the Fuzzlord Effects shop. So if that kind of stuff sounds interesting to you, be sure you check out some of the other videos on the channel after this one. Subscribe to the channel because I really appreciate the support. And as always, why don't you comment below and let me know how you're doing, where you're from, and here's the question of the video. What is the loudest amp setup that you have ever played through? I'm curious to know. So thanks for watching, and let's get started on this week's video. Doom metal amplifiers, volume, power, and headroom. So if you haven't been over there yet, I run an Instagram page called @FuzzlordEffects, as well as a website, fuzzlordeffects.com. Fuzzlordeffects.com is more of the sales into things, and you can check out what I'm working on and the different models of pedal and stuff. The Instagram page is kind of like a daily what we're up to at the shop. So I did a shout out on Instagram and asked folks what they would like to be answered in this video, and I got a bunch of great questions. So I'm gonna pull out the phone, I'm gonna scroll through and pick my favorite questions that I think are, interesting to talk about and also helpful to be talked about. And I appreciate everyone who commented. If you haven't checked out the page yet, @Fuzzlord Effects, please do me a favor and go over there and check it out. So let's start off with what I think is the simplest thing to talk about, which is volume. Doom metal music has really kind of got this reputation that volume is really part of it. So you're seeing guitarists playing 100 watt amps with full stacks, or 200 watt amps with 2 stacks is getting really common. It's one of those things where, it's a lot different. And it's, for me at the concerts, I like to wear earplugs. I stand up close, and it's kind of like, remember when everybody's putting subwoofers in their Honda and it was like all about how you felt the music and you could feel it moving through you? Similar concept. So first of all, first question, should I get a 50 watt amp or a 100 watt amp? For me personally, for this kind of music, I always think more is more as far as wattage goes. And this ties into like clean headroom and all those other kind of things, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. I kind of feel like if you have a choice between a 50 watt amp and a 100 watt amp, especially with this kind of music, mostly people are using a lot of pedals and stuff for their like fuzz tones and their distortions and stuff. So I recommend large amps. So if you think you need a 30 watt amp, get a 50 watt amp. If you think you need a 50 watt amp, get a 100 watt amp. Because, it sure feels good to turn them up. So louder, like big power amps, are going to kind of do well in this kind of music. Let me contrast that with the kind of the opposite spectrum of that. Let's say you're like a blues dude who really just loves that tube amp breakup, and you use your Strat or your Telecaster all the time, and you just crank a little like 5 watt champ and you mic it up at the club because you want that edge of breakup sound all the time, and that's your main tone, and maybe you kick on a tube screamer. A smaller amp's going to be for you. Now if you're about using fuzz pedals, big muffs, super fuzzes, HM2s, that kind of thing, I think 100 watt amps with about 8 12-inch speakers, a full stack, that's going to be your flavor. You're going to crank up this clean amplifier, hit that fuzz pedal, and just start rattling the walls. The last thing I will say concerning that topic about volume is that the easiest thing I found for most people is to set up your sound for your cleanest sound first. So if you got parts of your song that go to complete like jazz clean with some like really like lush reverb and delays and stuff like that, get your baseline sound on your amplifier like that first. We can always add more dirt on top of things, right? But if you take a cranked up, like an amp with where you crank up all the gains and everything and try to throw all these fuzz pedals and stuff at it, usually doesn't sound that good. So that is the first thing so that's the first thing we talked about today concerning how powerful of an amp I should get. So this next question I got on the Instagram page was concerning what is headroom? That is a word that gets thrown around so much that I think often is kind of mysterious to people. Here's how I can explain it. Headroom is like the amount of volume we can get out of a certain amplifier before it starts breaking up and getting a little distorted. Some of us want that, some of us don't. Let me tell you a story that I think really sums up the concept of headroom. This is the day that everything just made sense to me. I was playing music with some people, and the other guitar player had a 50-watt Marshall amplifier playing through a similar speaker cab that I was. I was playing a 120-watt Fuzzlord amplifier, and here's the deal. He had his amp cranked up really loud because he was trying to keep up with me, and he just cranked the gains, cranked the volumes, and he had a really distorted tone. It sounded good. It sounded like a nice crunchy Marshall. I was playing at a pretty high volume also with my gain dialed back really low. I like a clean tone a lot for my baseline sound. I add pedals on top of it, right? Here's the deal. A 50-watt amp and a 100-watt amp don't sound, the 100-watt amp does not sound twice as loud as the 50-watt amp. Our ears hear on a logarithmic scale. So, goofy tidbit for you. We sounded similar in volumes in the overall room to our ears. But here's the difference. He was playing a 50-watt completely cranked trying to keep up with me, and he had no headroom. It was all just distorted volume. If he was playing clean, he couldn't have hung. I was cranking 120 watts clean. So let's say I might have only been hitting 80 watts or so, actual clean. The deal is I had plenty more volume to go that was just dirty. So I was playing at 120 watts and I could have been playing in a jazz group or playing like some cool Fleetwood Mac, Peter Green kind of stuff. And this dude could have only played in like a rock setting. Does that make sense? You take a 50-watt amp and a 100-watt amp, and they might sound like similar volumes if we just like crank up the 50 and then, don't turn up the 100 all the way. However, the 100-watt amp is going to be able to go louder and stay clean. Does that make sense? I really like a baseline clean tone for all those like pretty spots in the song where you want to like bust out from the heavy stuff and play some clean stuff. So I really try to keep in mind like, oh, I want a 50-watt amp, that's what I'm using, or I want a 30-watt amp, that's what I'm using for this band. Well, if you want to play clean, maybe consider that 50-watt amp. I hope that makes sense in a way that kind of tells a story that helps stick with you. Headroom is about how much like clean volume we can get out of that amp before it starts breaking up. Next great question from Instagram. Thank you, Eli Lundgren. Master volume amps or non-master volume amps? That is the question. Let's try that again. Master volume amps or non-master volume amps? That is the question of the day. Here's what I gotta say on the topic. I like master volume amps. Not everyone does. Some people will say they affect the tone a little bit, but let me tell you what I think of it. Most of us, when we use our tube amps to get a crunchy gain kind of sound, most of our sound that we're thinking of, like a JCM 800 and those kind of things, when we're hitting that gain control, is the front end of the amplifier, the preamp section. Does that make sense? We're shaping our sound, we're getting some crunch, we're doing some EQ, then we're gonna hand it off to the power amp section to just take what we did and amplify the fuck out of it. There is such a thing as power amp distortion. I know you're already freaking out trying to be like, what about power amp distortion, Jason? Those figures go on the keyboard like crazy. It's a real thing. you don't hear it until you really start cranking up an amp. So a 100-watt amp, you're going to be shaking some walls before you're really getting that power amp distortion. So I think for most of us, the preamp distortion is what we're looking for like doom and stoner rock kind of music. So the basics of it is, I like them. We can use our preamp to like get some gain, get a little crunch going. Use our EQ, shape it all, do all this stuff. And then right before we hand it to the power amp section, we're just going to turn it down a little bit. What is the benefit of that? Well, you can take a 120-watt mat amp with a master volume and you can play it through a little small rig in your house and still get a nice doom metal tone, some crunchy stuff without pedals. Hopefully that cleared up some mystery. Let's go to the next question. Here's a good one. This is more about speakers rather than amplifiers. This one came from Beyond the Sun on Instagram. And the question is, what do I think about bass speakers being used in this kind of music, or 15-inch speakers? Well, here's what I got to say. If you're tuning in A sharp standard, or you doing drop F like Conan, are you doing some bong ripper stuff and playing them, what do they play, like F standard? You're almost playing a bass at that point. And I do think that 15-inch speakers, or speakers that were maybe hybrid guitar bass, or bass speakers that I have used, sound phenomenal. It's just one of those things that maybe let's take a Greenback Celestion. Those sound good at the tunings that guitars were meant for, that these designers that made the speaker were thinking of when they came up with this stuff. So if we're basically playing guitars that are tuned like a bass, and then boosting the bass and then cutting the treble, yeah, I do think bass speakers would work good. I don't think vice versa works. I don't think you should use guitar speakers on a bass, but if your guitar is essentially a bass that has 6 strings, nothing wrong with it. I have even gone as far as to use a Beta 52 microphone, which is traditionally used to record bass cabs or bass drums, and thrown that on my guitar cabs for recording, and I was very pleased with the results. Next question. Ooh, this is the one we've all been waiting for. Solid state or tube? Does tube volume mean louder? Does solid state not mean loud? Does tube amps sound better? That's a pretty convoluted question I just came up with, but let's talk about it. This is a thing that gets thrown around a lot about like, oh yeah, well my friend had a 100-watt amp, but my amp is a 100-watt tube, bruh. What you got to say about that? Here's what I got to say. Most people are running their solid state amplifiers that are high powered the wrong way. When people are designing these amps on a bench, there's no reason that a 100-watt solid state amp and a 100-watt tube amp would be different powers. They're not lying to you. They do bench tests and they measure these things, and you know, engineers don't really like to bullshit people. Here's what I will say about tube amps. Tube amps, when they distort, when we push them hard enough to start distorting, they do so in a way that our ears like. That's just the way it is. So I don't want to go into the whole Fourier response thing and you know, frequency spectrum analysis, because that's just a bunch of engineering bullshit. Tube amps, when we push them hard and they distort, they sound good. They saturate nicely. Now let's take a solid state like transistor amplifier, for example. They can still be loud, they can still sound good, we can still get some gain out of them, but sometimes when we push them really hard, or we throw pedals at them and stuff, when they distort and they clip, they just don't do so in a way that sounds as nice. Sometimes they sound a little splatty or a little farty. Now tubes, the big thing a lot of people may have read about already is that tubes accentuate a certain order of harmonics, and the solid state accentuates a certain other order of harmonics. But let's just leave it at that. When tube amps saturate and distort, they sound nice. When solid state stuff does the same thing, sometimes it doesn't sound as nice. Let's talk about power, because I think that's the really important one. We take a 120 watt tube amplifier, 100 watt, whatever you want to call it. True story, 100 watt Marshall amps are actually 120 watts, but they're rated 100 watt clean. Oh, cool. Most tube amplifiers are meant to run like an 8 or a 16 ohm cab, which is what we all have, right? We have a bunch of 16 ohm half stacks. So if we take two 16 ohm half stacks and we wire like daisy chain them, that makes an 8 ohm cab, and we run it over 8 ohm tap, we're good. So if we take like a 100 or 120 watt tube amp and we hook up our full stack, let's say we have two 16 ohm cabs and we wire them, like we daisy chain them so that they become an 8 ohm cab, and we run out of our 8 ohm output of our tube amp, we're good. We're gonna go hit 100 or 120 watts. Here's the issue that is consistent about everyone running these old PV amplifiers. The solid state ones are really cool, and the Sun beta leads and all that kind of stuff. If you turn that amp around and look at what speaker load it was ready to run, it'll say like, this is a 200 watt amp at 2 ohms. Or this is a 100 watt amp at 4 ohms. Does that make sense? Let me elaborate. The solid state amps are usually meant to run a different ohm speaker cabs. Think of the speaker cab ohm rating as like how much like resistance it's going to fight back against that amplifier. So we're going to take a tube amp and we're going to give it what it was ideally made for, and then we got 100 watts, right? The basic equation for power, please don't shoot me out over this one. I know it's much more complicated and we're not considering reactance. We're just going to consider the resistance of a speaker cab. V squared over R. So we have an amplifier that's going to throw a voltage at the speaker cab, and we're going to figure out some power from it, okay? V squared, that's just a number. We're going to ignore it. Let's put that over our 8 ohm cab because that is ideal. And then let's say that equation equaled 100 watts. The solid state amp that was meant to run V squared over R equals 200 watts. They're telling us to run a 2 ohm speaker cab or a 4 ohm speaker cab. Does that make sense? And then we're going to put a 16 ohm speaker cab, which is like a wall of resistance in front of it. So all of a sudden, instead of like getting a 200 watt amp, all of a sudden we're like knocked down to like 50 watts, for example. Does that make sense? Ideally, if we use the right speaker cab setup and hooked enough speakers up together to make that amp happy, they would be the same. But a lot of us are doing things like taking a 100 watt Marshall, plugging it into our 16 ohm cab out of our 16 ohm tap and getting 100 watts. Rad! We plug in our Sun beta lead, which is meant to run 4 ohms. We're putting 16 ohms in front of it, of the speaker cab. And then we're like, bro, it only sounds like a 50 watt amp. Because it is in that scenario. So before we go hating on how solid state amps and tube amp power is not the same thing, let's just flip that Sun beta lead around, look that it says it wants a 4 ohm cab. And how would we do that? Well, if we got a 16 ohm cab and a 16 ohm cab and a 16 ohm cab and a 16 ohm cab, and when we daisy chain them all together, we just made a 4 ohm wall of destruction. That is so cool. Again, if you have this in your band, let me know your band and I will come see y'all, because it's like, here's you guys, here's the band, here's me, here's the band, here's me. True story. Let's do 1 or 2 more questions. Here's a quick one. Should I get the 50 watt amp or should I get the 100 watt amp? Always the 100 watt amp. Yeah, true story. If you like the Doom stuff, 100 watt amp. I more would say, why not 200 watt amps, sir? I don't know. All right, this is gonna be the last one, and I think this is a really valid question, and I appreciate you for asking this, fluffy cuddle bitch. They asked if there's any like modern amplifiers that I think are good for this kind of music that aren't Mad Amp GT 120s, Orange OR 120s, old Bassmans. Basically just saying, like, is there anything affordable we can get now that aren't these legendary amplifiers that are extremely expensive? And there is. So let me tell you about them. Laney AOR 50 and 100 watt amps can be had for like $400 to $500 used in really good working shape, or even less. I sold a Laney AOR with the cab for like $600 a couple years ago. Killer deal. I mean, the thing was pristine. Another one is the Sovtech MiG 50. They have ones that are a couple years old that are really good amplifiers. I believe EHX started making a new model that's really good. Those are tube amps. I'm trying to think of other amplifiers in the market. I'm willing to say there's some Jet Cities and stuff out there that are good amplifiers, like just a good 100-watt tube amp. Most of their stuff's based off like a Marshall or copy of something else anyway, and that's pretty much what hovercraft amps are. Not that anyone's supposed to know that. They're just rebuilt Jet Cities. As far as solid state amps goes, of course there's the Sun Beta Lead. They're getting kind of rare. There's the PV, what are they, Rockmasters? No, they're not Rockmasters. You know which ones I'm talking about. And I think the most affordable, bang for your buck, kind of fun amplifier if you just want to play this kind of music and you're not like crazy about like getting a certain tone off a certain person's record, I like the Orange Crush 120. It's a solid state amp. It has a clean channel, a dirty channel, it's got reverb, and for as loud as they are, they're a good amp. They're built really well. I believe they're modeled after the Rock Reverb or the Thunder Reverb. Excuse me if I'm getting that mixed up. But I bought one, compared it to my Laney. I like them both for different things. The Orange is just good, loud, has a great clean tone, has a good dirty tone. Doesn't take pedals as well. However, it's reliable and I love it, and it's lightweight. So that was this week's video, everybody, and I really appreciate you watching and commenting, and of course being on the Instagram page and helping get the questions together for this video. And I hope you tune in next week. Again, be sure you subscribe below. Is it that side? I think it's that side. It's kind of hard because my camera split. And I hope you're having a good day, and please let me know below what is the loudest amp setup that you have ever played through, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks for watching.